Tensions between the U.S. and its two greatest adversaries, Russia and China, are at their highest in decades. The conflict in Ukraine, now half a year old, is seeing no end in sight. China's increased military drills near Taiwan also has the U.S. taking notice. Amid this tense atmosphere, Moscow and Beijing launched a week of military drills. Dubbed Vostok 2022, the war games also included several ex-Soviet states, India and Syria. Taking place in Russia's Far East and the Sea of Japan, the exercises involved more than 50,000 troops and 60 warships. The drills were the latest display of growing defense ties between China and Russia as their own relations with the West worsened. Russia, which is currently battling NATO-backed Ukrainian forces to a standstill, has condemned the alliance's eastward expansion. And just last week, the U.S. approved over $1 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, following up on last month's visit by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the self-governing island that Beijing claims as its own. The visit sparked weeks of military exercises by China that is fast changing the military balance around Taiwan. To further discuss the military drills between Russia and China, joining us from London is Elisabeth Braw. She is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And by Jennifer Murtazashvili, she is the president of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. And she joins us from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Thank you to the both of you for joining us here on Straight Talk today. Jennifer, let me start with you. Along with sending a message of unity and power to the United States, what does Russia and China aim to accomplish here with these war games?
So I think it's important for us to remember that the size of these war games is far smaller than they were 4 years ago. And let's remember 4 years ago, this Vostok exercise had 200,000 participants. This time it's 50,000. So although Russia and China, and I think in particular Russia, wants to send a very strong message of unity, I think that message is a bit diffuse at this time. Of course, China's participating in this, but I don't think that the message that it's sending is quite as strong as it was in the past.
Right, and Elisabeth, let me bring you in here. What do you make of the lineup of the countries that are participating in the drills? Some are ex-Soviet countries. We also have Syria and China taking place, of course. What do you make of this lineup?
Well, it's a sorry lineup, is it not? I mean, if these are the friends you have, yes, China's participating. China is a powerful country, but apart from China, it's mostly not very palatable countries. India is a sort of a case on a special case. It is a country that many countries would like to be friends with, but it likes to sort of play both sides. But apart from that, if you compare this exercise to NATO exercises that, of course, include somewhere around 30 countries, sometimes even more, because NATO invites partners, this is really a sorry state of affairs for Russia, and it does signal that not many countries want to conduct military exercises with Russia, and it signals that is a signal that's going out at just the time when Russia is desperate to prove its worth as a major military power.
So it's proving the opposite, in your opinion?
Absolutely.
All right, Jennifer, let me bring you in here. We're seeing an increase in defense ties between Russia and China, two countries with a powerful defense force. Do you think that the West should be worried that we're seeing this alliance grow?
So, of course, the United States and the West should be concerned about this relationship, but I think it's also important for us to remember that the strengthened military ties between Russia and China became even stronger after 2014, after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. You know, prior to 2014, Ukraine had been a very important partner with China in providing defense technologies and many things that Russia would not provided. This changed after 2014. We began to see stronger military ties between Russia and China. But let's also remember that Russia and China share a very long border. And, you know, in the long term, I think there is increased mistrust between China and Russia about the intentions of the other. So right now, this seems like a relationship that's of mutual benefit in the short term. But I think in the long term, we really have to keep our eye on this relationship because, China has not come out in support of Russia's war. China has really tried to maintain an equal footing with sanctions. Of course, it hasn't signed on to the sanctions, but it's doing its best to try to not violate those norms. So I think we have to take this with an incredible grain of salt and look at this in historical perspective. As Elisabeth mentioned, the groups, the individual countries that are participating in this, yes, it seems like a large and significant number. But if we look at, some of those countries, especially those in Central Asia that are members of the CSTO, they have increasingly frayed relations with Russia, yet they still participate. So participation in this kind of military exercise, I don't think we can say, substantially says anything about the future of this relationship.
All right, taking everything that Jennifer just said into consideration, Elisabeth, do you think that China and Russia will officially form a military alliance? I know that they've rejected that notion in the past before, but Putin recently said that such a prospect can't be ruled out.
I don't think they will, and they won't do so for a very obvious reason, which is that they don't share any values. They share tactical interests and or strategic interests. Which is to limit the power of NATO. But you have to, if you're going to form a sort of a counter alliance to NATO, you have to have values in common, and that's what the Soviet bloc countries had back in the day. You can say, well, what were those values worth? Not very much, because the Warsaw Pact collapsed. But nevertheless, they had this shared faith in socialism. Russia and China share nothing apart from dislike or distrust or animosity of the West or animosity towards the West. And so if you have that, the only thing you have in common is whom you dislike or whom you are trying to counter, then you cannot cooperate on a basis of trust, which is what's needed in operating a military alliance. And we should remember that the Soviet Union back in the day and China never trusted each other, and Russia and China don't trust each other today either.
Well, it seems like it's enough reason for both countries to lean on each other for support in their own aspirations. We're seeing China back Russia's aspirations in Ukraine, and we're seeing Russia do the same for China's aspirations in Taiwan. Jennifer, could we see China get more aggressive with its response to Taiwan, especially after Nancy Pelosi's visit and the military drills that we saw it conduct?
I mean, I think at this point, for any of us to say, anything is off the table, I think we've learned from the past 6 months that it's really dangerous to say something like that. But China is a very different country than Russia. China has a robust economic ties with the rest of the world that it depends on. And I think we'd have to ask ourselves the question of whether China could withstand the kinds of sanctions coming from the West if it were to invade Taiwan. But we'd also have to ask whether the West could sustain those kinds of sanctions as well. So China, is in a much better position in many ways. But I do think that an invasion of Taiwan at this point is quite unlikely.
All right, let's talk a bit about India's role here. Elisabeth, you mentioned India because it's taking part in these war games, but it hasn't fallen short of depicting itself as a pro-Western ally. I mean, it's even purchased S-400s, which it has gotten little attention from the West compared to when Turkey purchased S-400s. It was slapped with sanctions and it was condemned widely across the West. Why is India still seen as a friend of the West when it continues to buy Russian oil, when it's taking part in these drills, and when it's part of so many Russian groups?
Yeah, it does seem a bit unfair, does it not, that Turkey gets gets a lot of anger when it buys Russian equipment, and India gets no anger or is punished in no way. But we should also remember that Turkey is, of course, a member of NATO, which means that it's judged by higher standards than India, which is not even a partner in any way of NATO. And the interesting thing about India, dating back really to the moment it was founded as a when after it gained independence from the UK, is that it has taken pursued this path of neutrality, and that was it was very strong power within this non-aligned movement during the Cold War, and that position has continued until today. I'm often on Indian television shows, and it's interesting how often and how vigorously the idea comes up that it's horrible, it's detestable that the West would expect India to just follow along with whatever measures the West is undertaking vis-a-vis Russia. The Indian commentators always make a very energetic point that India can do as it likes, and it may decide to impose sanctions on Russia or other measures, but it doesn't want to be told what to do by the West. And then there is another thing, which is that we as the West really need India if we're going to reduce our dependence on China for manufacturing. Right. On the Chinese market, then we need India as a sort of a new market to focus on, which is, I think, another reason why we as the West are not too judgmental of India.
Jennifer, would you say that the U.S. needs India to counter China? What's their strategy when it comes to dealing with a country that has been criticized for its human rights abuses, the lack of democracy in the country, freedom of speech, and to top it off, all its ties it has with Russia?
So I think one thing important to remember in all of this is, yes, India is participating, but look at India's relationship with China in recent years. We've seen border conflicts. We've seen even people killed on both sides of this border in recent years. So I think relations between China and India are extremely fraught. And so to think that, I think this is a very symbolic move on the part of India. There's a very small contingent of Indian soldiers participating. They're not participating in the naval exercises that are going to take place. And another thing that's important to remember is the U.S. is conducting military exercises inside of India as well. So I think India is really trying to play all sides here. It's drifted towards the West, of course, in recent years, and it's really difficult for it to maintain that position. India has a huge population. It's going to suffer enormously if it would participate in the sanctions regime. Its economy is already struggling so much because of this. So I think that there's so much at stake for India. Nothing is simple.
All right, Elisabeth Braw and Jennifer Murtazashvili, thank you so much for joining us here on Straight Talk and joining the discussion. It was a pleasure speaking to you.